live on on YouTube, and welcome to episode 71 of Wednesday Night Live. And tonight I had envisioned talking about bone, joint, and muscle health. That's what we titled it. And it was a big task, actually, to try to put all that together. So as I was getting into it and sort of preparing things, I was actually fairly blown away at the advances in understanding from a lifestyle perspective osteoporosis. And so tonight we're going to actually focus on osteoporosis. And we'll talk about essentially what it is. We'll get into some of the causes, the risk factors, and the lifestyle suggestions, diet, as well as supplements that could potentially help. And when you think of excuse me, when you think of osteoporosis, you think of it as a women's disease. But in fact, 1/3 of people with osteoporosis are men, and 25% of men will actually have a fracture that's related to osteoporosis in their life. It's a very, very high number and should come as a surprise because the overall thinking, the paradigm of thinking about osteoporosis as a hormonal disease that affects women is actually fairly outdated. And as new information comes in, it's a lot more complicated. And you can always say that with the body, that it's a lot more complicated because there are so many factors that are interrelated. And we're even going to talk about a connection between osteoporosis and heart disease, believe it or not. And I found that really interesting as I was sort of putting this together. Another thing that I hope you find by the end of tonight's episode 71 is that we are seeing things from the lens of osteoporosis. Now, what I mean by that is when we looked at, say, looking at heart disease risk factors, it allowed us to look at the body through the lens of heart disease. And we could see how there are so many different parts of the body and different systems of the body. You know, there's the endocrine system that it can affect so many different things. And we spoke about how all these different systems in the body can play a role when it comes to the heart. And, you know, it reminds me that, you know, when my father started out in practice, he was a very traditional family practice doctor, and he would see everything. He still is seeing patients. And essentially, one of the things that was interesting is that when doctors specialize, they often see things through a very narrow lens. They see everything through the lens of the heart. If they're a cardiologist, they see everything through the lens of, you know, the skin. If they're a dermatologist, they see everything through the lens of the kidneys. If they're a nephrologist. And a lot of doctors have lost the ability to look at all of the systems. And what I'm hoping, actually, from a much lower scientific level, but I believe that all of you are capable of looking at the body through all these different lenses, through discussions just like this. So tonight, I'm hoping that you see the condition of osteoporosis as a symptom of a whole host of things going on all across the body. And I'm hoping that by the end of tonight's class, you'll actually have a greater understanding of the body as a whole and some of the lifestyle factors that play into the degradation of bone. And I think that's what really captured my interest as I was putting this together. And I wasn't able to get to the next topic, but ultimately, because this is such a very significant health problem that we're seeing in today's world, I think that it deserves an episode of itself. And so tonight, episode 71, we're going to talk about osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is basically a condition where the bone mass and the bone density is decreased. Now, one of the things that we have to realize is that most people, when they think of bone as almost, in their mind, they probably see, like a skeleton. And you think of the skeleton, this bone, it seems like the bone is almost like not alive. We tend to think of it almost like, like our nails or our hair as some kind of part of our body that isn't alive. But in fact, the bone is actually a very, very living organism in the sense that it has blood vessels that are supplying it, and it has a whole bunch of cells that are constantly taking away calcium and putting calcium back and shaping things based on movement and exercise and musculature. And you can think of it as this living, breathing, kind of slowly molding and um, and and evolving kind of tissue, as opposed to what we think of as sort of this unliving type of thing. Now, there are two basic cells in the bone that we'll be talking about quite a bit tonight. The first is called an osteoblast. And in medical school, the way I remembered osteoblast, so there are two cells. One's called an osteoblast. There are multiple types of cells, but there are two main ones we'll talk about: osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Now, how I remember what each one of those does. Osteoblasts, it's a B, osteoblast. So the mnemonic I used in medical school was B for birth. So osteoblasts form new cells, and then there are osteoclasts, so they basically clip or take away. So you can remember B for blast and C for clip, taking away. And so these two cells are constantly in a type of balance where, depending on stresses in the body, the need for calcium, whatever the case may be, your body sometimes needs to break down some of the bone. Either it's reforming and reshaping, or your body is in need of calcium. Now, calcium plays an enormous number of roles in your body. It's responsible for partly buffering the systems in your body. It's also responsible for allowing cells to communicate. So in the heart, it's very important for the cells to be able to contract. In neurons, to sort of propagate these messages through neurons, you need calcium running in and out of cells. So it has an enormous number of functions. And we're going to certainly spend a fair amount of time tonight talking a little bit about the roles of calcium in the body. But at this point, what I want to establish is that we understand that bone is this very living organism with osteoblasts and osteoclasts, cells birthing and taking away, clipping, and moving things around based on the needs of the overall body. So we can think of the bone as a reservoir. One of the things it's doing is it's a reservoir for calcium for all these incredibly diverse functions that go into overall health. Now, there are lots of different factors that play a part in keeping this balance between osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And what we're going to see is there are multiple lifestyle things that go on and chronic health conditions that are resulting in this shifting of, and it basically creating this imbalance between these cells, such that the bone mineral density is basically decreasing. So here we have this living bone. It's incredibly living and moving and morphing, and releasing calcium and taking calcium back depending on the needs of the body. But here we go, modern lifestyle, sometimes things that are just happening with aging are happening, and it's resulting in, again, that sort of imbalance. So we spoke about how 1/3 of people with osteoporosis are men. And honestly, this also is one of those things that leads to a decrease in the diagnosis, because even most doctors, unfortunately, are still under the paradigm of thinking about osteoporosis as a women's disease that's based on hormones. And of course, we'll speak about that in just a moment. But it's really a multifaceted disease with a whole host of things going on, which, as you can see from my initial description of what's going on, basically makes sense. But unfortunately, still, initially, we know about how synthetic hormones were used to treat women with osteoporosis, which goes along with this notion that it was a hormonal disease. And certainly hormones do play a role. But tonight, what I'd like to focus in on is all the other factors that are leading to this. So just as a brief summary, we're talking about things like hormones. We'll get into elevated blood sugar. We'll talk about oxidative stress and inflammation. All of these things, all of these things are going to increase your risk for osteoporosis. And we know enough, even up until this point in tonight's episode, that essentially, it's leading to this imbalance that we spoke about in the beginning, where it's taking away more than it's supposed to, basically. Or it could be that it's slowing the rate of the osteoblasts that are laying down the bone. So it's going to be this imbalance, and it's not so much important that you understand, whether it's increasing the osteoclasts or decreasing osteoblast activity, just that the fact that there is an imbalance that's happening. So let's talk a little bit about, let's just jump right into it. And since I mentioned it earlier, I spoke about how there is kind of sort of a conceptual connection between heart disease and osteoporosis. Now, this sort of revolves around the idea of vitamin K. And we're going to I'll probably mention it early on, like now, and then near the end of the class, we'll talk a little bit more about it as well. But essentially, we know that there is a loss of calcium in the bones with osteoporosis. And atherosclerosis, heart disease, is sort of the opposite. So we have basically sort of a mirror image here, which is where where osteoporosis is leading to calcium leaking out of the bones. And with atherosclerosis, we're actually getting deposition of calcium into the arteries. And essentially, what is responsible for this sort of thing is vitamin K. Vitamin K is responsible for this sort of imbalance, in the sense that if you don't have calcium, if you don't have enough vitamin K in your system, it's not going to put the calcium where it's supposed to be. If it's incredibly low, you're going to end up with calcium where you don't want it. As an example, it's getting put in the arteries with atherosclerosis. It essentially acts as a cofactor for a bone protein called osteocalcin that basically gives bones their strength. Now, when I say it's a cofactor, what that means is that there's certain enzymes. You can think of enzymes as sort of like workers, almost bringing things together, and you can think of a cofactor as almost like a foreman who is needed to give orders to the enzyme to do what it's supposed to do. So the enzyme essentially can't do what it's supposed to do if vitamin K is not on board. Now, there are two kinds of vitamin K. There's vitamin K1, which is found in leafy green vegetables. And then there's vitamin K2, which is usually the product of fermentation. So it's often found in things like hard cheeses. My favorite source is something called natto, which I probably mention just about every episode because it's a fermented soybean that has really been associated with an enormous health benefit. And it's actually the highest source of vitamin K2 on the planet. But if you can't get natto or you don't like the flavor or smell of natto, then you do have to be careful that you get vitamin K2 into your diet. And really, the most reliable way of doing that is to get it in a multivitamin or to take it as a supplement. It's going to allow you to basically put calcium where it's supposed to be. And you don't want it in your arteries, that's for sure. You want to be able to direct the calcium to a place that is where it's meant to be, which is essentially bones. And there were some studies in Rotterdam. There was a Rotterdam heart study that basically showed that there was much lower risk for heart disease in patients who were taking vitamin K2. Now, we do know Also, that especially with K2 supplementation, that in women with K2 supplementation, that their vertebral fracture risk was less by 60%, their hip fractures by 77%, and their non-vertebral fractures by 81% by supplementing with K2. So you do need to make sure that the multivitamin that you're taking, or if you're taking, say, some women are taking like a bone supplement, and sometimes they include K2. It might be a combination of vitamin D and calcium. But either way, you need to make sure that either you're getting a source for K2, a dependable source for K2 in your diet, like natto, or you're getting it as a supplement. As far as vitamin K1 goes, we've spoken about that before as well, and you're going to get that from leafy green vegetables. Next is this issue of pro-oxidant damage, inflammation. We've spoken about how inflammation is associated with a whole host of chronic conditions, from heart disease to cancer to diabetes. Well, the same thing goes here. When you have this pro-oxidant damage that's happening in your body and in general inflammation, we spoke about anti-inflammatory lifestyle in other episodes, but ultimately we have to remember that this inflammation that we've spent so much time talking about and all those other things is also potentially causing that imbalance between those two cells that we spoke about. Next is something called AGEs. These are advanced glycation end products. Now, these came up when we spoke about aging. They came up when we spoke about diabetes. And essentially what advanced glycation end products are is when your blood sugar goes up, your blood sugar binds to protein. And when it binds to protein, it binds it irreversibly, which basically means that you can't separate them. And when sugar binds to protein, if it binds to protein in the eyes, you can get retinopathy. If it binds to protein in your skin, it changes the collagen structure, and so you get some increased wrinkling. If you get this type of binding in your tendons and muscles, you get stiffness. In short, it's essentially one of the main things that's causing a great deal of aging. Now, in osteoporosis, what's happening with this binding, which, again, we've spoken about so many times, of sugar to protein, when this binds to protein in bones, it's increasing those osteoclasts. Remember the osteoclasts, the C, clipping. So if it's increasing osteoclasts, it's basically going to take away bone, and also causes there to be fewer osteoblasts. Remember the osteoblasts, the B, they birth these cells in the bone. So here we're rounding out this picture of advanced glycation end products, which we've spoken about so many times in the past. And this was something that quite frankly, I was actually I wouldn't say I was surprised that it had this role in osteoporosis, but it's certainly something that I didn't understand before doing sort of the preparation for this. And it just gives me even more fuel to really spend time talking about making sure that you have a clear understanding of whether your blood sugar is spiking, because anytime your blood sugar is spiking, you're going to get more of this what's called glycation. We've spoken again about oxidation and inflammation, and essentially what's happening, which we really only need to remember, is again that imbalance. But specifically speaking, with oxidation, you're basically getting impaired bone formation and promoting more osteoclastic activity, the taking away. So, and the additional thing is that something also in terms of inflammation. Remember when we spoke about weight loss, general weight loss, and how the visceral fat, the fat that's surrounding your organs, is 3 times as inflammatory as the fat on the rest of your body, but that the fat all over your body is a metabolically active organ in the sense that it is releasing inflammatory cytokines. And if you have those particular ones that are surrounding your organs, which again are, as we've said before, are 3 times more metabolically active, these are going to lead to insulin, problems with insulin sensitivity. And bringing it all around again, when you have impaired insulin sensitivity, this is also going to slow down bone production. And remember now, we've established the fact that the bone is this really dynamic tissue. And so even though you have bone, it's always forming and, it's letting calcium out, it's bringing calcium back in. And so if you're slowing down bone production, then that's going to potentially lead to this sort of imbalance. So here we have sort of, we could think about it as a global picture. We have a high blood sugar, which is binding to bone, these advanced glycation end products. That's raising osteoclast activity, the cells that take away, which is releasing calcium. And then you have vitamin K imbalances doing all the same things similarly if you don't have enough vitamin K. And then all of those things that we just mentioned, high blood sugar with binding of proteins, as well as abnormal circulation of calcium and vitamin K imbalances, all this is also in a way connected to, you could see the connection between that and atherosclerosis, heart disease. So it's a very elaborate sort of, domino effect of different things happening that are unfortunately the result of lots of things that we're going to sort of elaborate now. So we do know that that women have it more likely, and of course there are hormonal issues that are associated with that. Also, family history. If you're overweight, actually obesity used to be thought of as, not obesity, but having a little extra weight was supposed to be thought of as a little bit of protection, maybe because they felt that there was more weight bearing on the bones, because again, we'll talk about exercise in just a moment, but the more weight bearing exercise you do, and the more musculature that you have, you're going to have denser bones, you're going to have healthier bones. So at some point it was thought to be protective to have some extra weight on you, but it's really not really thought to be that way. There are medications that can cause some imbalances. SSRIs that are used for depression can increase your risk for osteoporosis. Coumadin, which is a blood thinner, that works through vitamin K. So that partly explains why Coumadin can cause issues with vitamin K. And unfortunately, when people are on Coumadin, they're told that to stay away from vitamin K because it can impair the ability of it's a blood thinner. So it can impair the amount of vitamin K you take. It could impair the ability of the Coumadin to thin the blood. And therefore, it's not uncommon to see elderly patients who've been on Coumadin a long time who have not been eating any vegetables at all. The interesting thing about Coumadin is that if someone is on Coumadin and they eat a constant amount of vitamin K, then they're able to monitor, they're able to adjust the Coumadin level. Coumadin is not as used as much because we now have a lot of new medicines for that. But anyway, if someone is on Coumadin, they can have vitamin K. It's just they need to have their level of Coumadin adjusted, and then it needs to be sort of constant. So we spoke about this issue with weight bearingness, and when we have to understand that the muscles attach to the bones, and when you're in anatomy class, you could see these little sort of out pouches of bones, which is where the insertions of the bones of the muscles go on the bones. And so muscle strength, because they're attached to the bones, goes hand in hand with bone strength. If you maintain musculature and really focus on making sure that your body does not decrease in muscle mass, that's something called sarcopenia. That is one of the worst things it's one of the things that everyone has to be battling. Everyone after the age of 30 even, there is a significant decrease in muscle mass. And unfortunately, you can't necessarily see the change in muscle mass. What's actually happening is that sometimes just the muscle itself it's becoming like marbled state. I mean, it might have in your 20s, that would have been like, looking at a steak, it would have been just all red, no marbling, just solid muscle. As you get older, naturally, you start to get a little bit of fat into the muscle. If you're not really training and fighting, you've got to be a warrior to age. That's probably the biggest message I think that I've gotten from just preparing all these talks is you have to be in training as you get older. And, I related the story before that I had this really top, when I lived in Santa Monica in California, I had this very famous celebrity trainer in my building. And, and I had several of his DVDs. He was very popular in introducing kettlebells, which are these Russian kettlebell workouts, weights. Anyway, so he would always, after I, introduced myself, and he probably didn't like me much because I was always asking him questions in the elevator about training and such. But yeah, he would see me and he would say, how's your training going? And at the time, sure I exercised, but I never thought about this concept of being in training. And you know what? After going through preparing all these talks, I am more of the opinion now that with aging, you have to be a warrior. You have to be focused on, you are in training. You're in training to be healthy, and you should be focused on making sure that you spend, a certain part of every day in training. So anyway, that was a sidebar, but getting back to these muscles, as you get older, you're starting to get a little bit of fat in the muscle, and you might not even look any different at all because the size looks exactly the same, but metabolically you've changed because there's different metabolic rate between muscle and fat. And as you get older and older, if you're not concentrated on doing some sort of resistance work, excuse me, then you really need to focus on that. And you need to make sure as you're getting older, there's a lot more leeway for protein intake. You need to make sure you're getting enough protein. But the point here is that muscle strength goes hand in hand with bone strength. So getting your muscles in shape, making sure you have the adequate muscle strength and muscle density, and that you're not losing, you're working as hard as you can to make sure you're maintaining muscle. That is all going to stimulate those cells. You probably know them, the ones that birth osteoblasts. It's going to stimulate osteoblasts. And it's going to ensure that your bones are capable of laying down bone and becoming stronger through exercise. And that is done through weight-bearing exercise. Swimming isn't going to do it, but jumping jacks, walking, jumping around, anything weight-bearing is going to do that. Some doctors have recommended for people who are not doing women who are not doing a whole lot of exercise, they have these weight-bearing vests that you can wear for a couple hours a day. They've been shown to help with osteoporosis. But ultimately speaking, we have to remember that muscle mass is important, very, very important for osteoporosis, and making sure that you're getting adequate protein. Now, I've spoken a great deal in the past about the importance I've spoken about how most people actually tend to eat too much animal protein. But as you get older, your requirements for protein become even more important, of course, as you're seeing. And so as you get older, if you are losing muscle mass and you're working, that is a position where increasing animal protein can be very, very helpful. You obviously need to be dealing with this on a case-by-case basis for yourself, and assessing whether or not you are in a situation where you're losing muscle mass, having a general understanding of what your body fat percentage is, and when you are sort of following overall, just generally speaking, your your body composition, this gives you an idea of whether or not perhaps you need to increase animal protein. And one of the ways you can actually measure body composition as well as bone density is a Dexa scan. A Dexa scan is really the gold standard for measuring bone density. But if you type into Google and you type in something like local Dexa scan center for body fat percentage, there are centers that are around that will give you your body fat percentage through the use of the Dexa scan. They charge like $50 or $100, and it's actually probably one of the most effective ways of determining body fat percentage. Most people don't know that, and it uses a very small amount of X-rays. So from an X-ray perspective, it's not to worry, and gives you a very, very accurate thing, and it is a relatively inexpensive way to check your body fat percentage. Obviously, I've always recommended people get scales at home, but those scales that check your body fat percentage, they're not the most, they're good at being able to track trends. Whether they give you your absolute body fat percentage, they're not perfect. But if you are getting older and you are getting into that stage where you're getting Dexa scan for osteoporosis, you might want to find out if they can also do. It's usually separate centers that are focused on that. They can use the Dexa scan as well to get body fat percentage. Okay, so we've spoken about protein. We've spoken about exercise. Obviously, being sedentary is going to greatly increase your risk. And ethnicity, Caucasians, South Asians have the highest risk. But also, we have to remember that metabolic syndrome, which we've spoken about in the context of heart disease and diabetes, is the condition where you have, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high triglycerides, cholesterol, and all of these things are going to also contribute to this imbalance between the osteoblast and the osteoclast. Estrogen exposure, remember we've spoken about how it's a hormonal issue. Women who had late puberty or early menopause are at an increased risk. Stress and depression can also, increasing cortisol and suppression of sex hormone production is also going to increase mineral loss, calcium loss in the bones. Okay, so we spoke about the Dexa scan already, so we'll move right on to prevention. And just doing a time check. And I see there's some comments here. Sorry about that. Yes. So the astronauts with weightlessness get osteoporosis in just like very short flights. So my father's actually making a comment about that. And he's certainly seen a lot of patients with osteoporosis in his career. Yeah, it's amazing actually. That's a great point. The weightlessness, I mean, apparently it's insane how much bone density they lose when they go into space. I think the cosmonaut that was there for like a month, or I mean for like a couple years or something, they had to like literally take him off. I think they were literally afraid that he would break his leg stepping out into regular gravity because he had lost so much bone density. They literally carried him out on a stretcher, and really just in a short 1 month space flight, the amount of bone density loss is really tremendous. So that's a great point, Dad. Okay, so let's go into things like vitamin D, trace minerals, magnesium, etc. So vitamin D, everyone who is dealing with osteoporosis knows you have to have vitamin D. Vitamin D does many different things. It promotes uptake of calcium in the intestine. It also regulates how much calcium enters and leaves the bone based on the body's requirements. So it's also regulating that as well. Magnesium is also really, really important. Most people are deficient in magnesium. It's involved with calcium transport and And as you get older, unfortunately, most people's diet, they're not getting a whole lot of magnesium, generally speaking. But there's also increased urinary excretion. So you're losing it through the urine as you get older. Stress obviously depletes it, and nuts and seeds are really the best ways beyond supplementation, which actually I do recommend almost everyone do magnesium supplementation, because almost everyone is low. There is a way of checking red blood cell magnesium, but I was recently reading that blood magnesium is not effective to be able to tell whether or not you're deficient in magnesium, because your blood needs to maintain a very specific magnesium level at the cost at any and all costs, which means that inside the cells, it may actually be low because it's just pushing everything out to maintain that very, very careful level in your bloodstream. But there is a test called red blood cell magnesium, so you can look at the magnesium inside the red blood cell as a different indicator. Trace minerals, silica, prevents calcium loss. You'll see that in some bone supplement formulas. And along with calcium and vitamin D, it improves the production of bone proteins. Boron is another element metal that is basically induces the osteoblasts, and is also involved in things like hormones like testosterone and vitamin D. It increases the half-life of vitamin D and some hormones. It's really amazing. I fell into like a rabbit hole of boron, what it does in the body. It's incredibly complex. And I was really quite amazed at all the things that boron is responsible for. And when you find there are certain preparations, bone supplement preparations that include boron. It's found in leafy greens, prunes, raisins are very, very high, and has an anti-inflammatory effect as well. And we spoke about K1 and K2, vitamin K1 and K2. And let's just review it because I think it's so important. So K1 is found in leafy green vegetables. And then K2, you must have in a supplement, or if you're eating natto, because it's going to allow the calcium to be put where you want it. Collagen is also very important. It makes up most of the structure of the bone, believe it or not. It's sort of like providing just like in the skin, there's provides some of the flexibility, and it helps reduce stress fractures. You don't want bone that is just like solid calcium. You want bone that has collagen that can move and provide some sort of cushioning. Vitamin C is also incredibly helpful. It suppresses the osteoclasts, and it promotes the osteoblasts, which of course you all know exactly what that means. And of course, it's anti-inflammatory as well. And really anything that's anti-inflammatory potentially can have some role here, if inflammation is something that's contributing overall to the osteoporosis. So the things that have actually been looked at, omega-3s, curcumin, resveratrol, which we've spoken about in the longevity talk. It sort of acts as what we call a calorie restriction mimetic. We've spoken about how different types of calorie restriction probably are able to extend life, and resveratrol acts as if it activates certain things in your body that mimic calorie restriction, but also remarkably, it affects genes that basically, when you think of stem cells, stem cells could be turned into, by nature of them being stem cells, they could be turned into, a bone cell, or they could be turned into a fat cell. Resveratrol, oddly enough, in this case, is able to make sure that the stem cells don't get converted into fat, but get converted into bone. So that's sort of an interesting thing. And then we know about calcium. We haven't spoken too much about calcium, but essentially most people don't get enough. It suppresses the osteoclast generally if you're getting enough. And ultimately, greens, beans, nuts, seeds, All of these things have calcium. Greens tend to have quite a bit of calcium. And you do absorb around 50% of the calcium in when you eat leafy greens. You don't absorb all of it. You absorb around 50%. In dairy, you absorb actually around 32% of the calcium, but the overall calcium level potentially could be higher. Regardless, you can get enough calcium. Most people need to take a small amount of supplemental calcium. You don't want to overdo it, because there have been some studies to show that too much calcium can cause some issues. But regardless, you should know that there is calcium in dark leafy green vegetables, as well as beans and seeds. And finally, just doing a time check, we should realize that we have covered an enormous number of things that relate to overall lifestyle. We've spoken about blood sugar and how that is going to affect things through binding of the blood sugar to these proteins, causing problems. We've spoken about this issue with not getting enough vitamin K2, or the importance of trace minerals, which again, like magnesium, boron, etc., all these things found in various plants, basically. And we've spoken about an anti-inflammatory nature as well. We've spoken about the importance of weight-bearing exercise. And I really think that we don't spend enough time talking about osteoporosis and how important it is overall to be able to get this broader understanding of all the different factors that are playing a role in osteoporosis. So things to avoid: look, if you have way too much salt, we all need sodium, but if you're eating too much sodium, that's actually going to cause you to lose more calcium than normal. Excessive amounts of caffeine. We're talking people who are constantly, coffee in the morning is not going to do it, but if you're like a 4 or 5 cup kind of person during the day, that is going to promote calcium loss, and is associated with bone loss, in fact. And any kind of soda is whether it's diet or not, is also going to result in it actually releases, or increases, I should say, a parathyroid hormone, which is basically eventually going to lead to calcium loss. So all of those things you should just be cautious of. So if you're eating enormous amounts of greens, beans, nuts, seeds, you are trying to manage your body composition, or at least become more conscious of what type of body fat percentage you have, making sure that your blood sugar doesn't spike, that you're getting adequate nutrients like vitamin K and vitamin D. You're participating or eating an anti-inflammatory diet, again, with lots of leafy vegetables, greens, beans, nuts, seeds. All of these things are going to reduce your risk, which then brings us back to that whole idea that we started with in the beginning, that we have this overall balance. And I hope you can see that if you're living, look, a lot of things life is difficult and we can't get everything perfect, but I'm hoping that when you see that there's this delicate balance that tends to be balanced when we are capable of living a very natural lifestyle and we're getting our weight-bearing exercise, that the balance has a way of restoring itself. As we get older, we realize that our calcium levels become a little bit more difficult to maintain. Our magnesium levels become a little bit more difficult to maintain, and our muscle mass becomes a little bit more difficult to obtain. And all of these things, which we've spoken about at length, interacting with other parts of the body, now we see it sort of honing in on bone health, and we realize that for us to have strong bones, we need to make sure that we're exercising and eating a nutrient-dense diet, getting the exercise that we need. And those last things that I just said pertain to just about everything that we've spoken about when it comes to heart disease, diabetes, blood sugar issues, even inflammatory conditions, cancer, and overall aging. All of these things sort of, come together so that you see this sort of symphony of everything that's happening. And it just so happens that's the same, not completely identical recommendations for overall health, overall healthy lifestyle are going to contribute. And what I find to be most miraculous is how they actually do this and how they're acting in such a unique way on the bone, and they're interacting in such a unique way in the skin and in the heart in different ways, yet generally speaking, the same recommendations follow, and they're interacting in different ways. And to me, that is the miraculousness of the human body, and how I hope you can see that it's not as confusing. A healthy lifestyle is not as confusing as the press reports make them out to be. I hope you can, obviously, I think all of you know that, but it's interesting just to see it from the lens of one particular condition. So I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover tonight. Again, I not only fell down the rabbit hole of boron when I was learning about just the incredible complexity of what boron does in the body, but in a sense, I fell down a rabbit hole of osteoporosis, when in fact I intended to speak about a whole host of other things. But when you realize that this is both a male and a female disease that is, quite epidemic in our society, it felt very important to discuss as a full episode. So thank you all for your attention. Next week, we are going to talk about anxiety and lifestyle and supplement suggestions. And believe it or not, you're going to see some very, similarities between certain suggestions, believe it or not. And of course, all of these things come back to sometimes overall lifestyle, but we're also talking about specific things like mental imagery, which I've used for patients with anxiety over the years. And I'll give you an exercise for that. But we'll also talk about lifestyle suggestions, supplements, things that make anxiety worse from a body perspective, from a nutritional perspective, lifestyle perspective, all that sort of stuff. And as my father is pointing out in the comments, he's saying that now that people are living longer, these sorts of topics are incredibly important. They're important because there are changes that happen as you get older. And thank goodness that there's all kinds of literature out there to know that, okay, yes, we now know that you need to watch, as an example for this class, you need to make sure you're getting your magnesium. We need to make sure your protein is adequate. You should be checking your hormonal status, once a year with blood work, something I didn't mention. You should be doing weight-bearing exercise. All these things we now know because we've done, scientists have done studies to show what is needed as you get older to be able to maintain health as you get older. So, okay, before I get sidetracked into another completely different topic, I will say goodnight. And again, thank you all for your attention. I enjoy giving these little Wednesday night lives, and I will see you next Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And I wish everyone a good rest of the week, and get that weight-bearing exercise in, and your magnesium, and take your vitamin D, and everything I said. So wish everyone a good night. Have a great one.